Last season, Miami was led by their running game, where they ranked 65th and averaged 158.1 yards per game. The passing game didn't quite fare as well. It ranked 121st, averaging 165.4 yards per game. The passing game was undoubtedly hampered when it lost star quarterback Brett Gabbert for the season in Week 8 versus Toledo with a broken leg. Avion Smith stepped in and led the team the rest of the way into the MAC championship. This offseason, Brett Gabbert announced that he would return, but they did lose Avion Smith in the transfer portal. How did that quarterback room look this spring?
Yeah, the quarterbacks looked great. I think at the spring game and throughout spring practice, Brett Gabbert was really the shining star of that Miami team, which you'd expect. He was MAC Freshman of the Year all the way back in 2018 when I was a senior in high school. So he's certainly a very experienced college quarterback. And Avion Smith leaving, certainly a big problem. He won the MAC championship game last year as a quarterback. But Maddox Kopp, who started his career at Houston, then went to play at Colorado, left Colorado when Deion Sanders showed up, came to Miami, couldn't play last year due to eligibility issues, but he is slated to be the backup right now. He looks really strong in spring camp. He's a really got a good arm, a really big guy. You probably watched the Avocados from Mexico Cure Bowl last year where Maddox Kopp took about half the snaps. And you just really couldn't glean anything from that game because it was
a mess, man.
Yeah, it was. A lot of people around here started calling it the Swamp Bowl, which I think is...
when they're like 14 or 13 fumbles, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is there were so many fumbles that nobody could even keep track. Like ESPN said there was 12. Miami said there was 11. I saw someone else said there was 10. But yeah, it was the sloppiest football game I've ever watched.
Yeah. How's Brett Gabbert's recovery coming along?
So I talked to him about 3 weeks after he got injured, and he said he wasn't even sure if he wanted to keep playing football. And on April 20th, on Saturday, he was on the field. So he most certainly is playing football. As far as I know, the leg looked good. He was moving around out there kind of crazy just because that injury was really not that long ago, and it was a pretty bad injury. But he seems to be doing well in his recovery, and I fully expect he'll be ready for the start of the season in August.
That's great news to hear.
Yeah.
Let's move over to that running game, which kind of, like I said, was a kind of a strong suit last year, but they took some hits in the offseason. They lost a 1,000-yard back, Rashad Amos, off to the transfer portal. I think he recently committed to Mississippi State, I believe.
Right.
But not all hope is lost. They returned Kenny Tracy, Keon Mosey, and a host of others. They also bring in Purdue transfer Dylan Downing. How did that running back room look in the spring?
Yeah, the running backs looked pretty good. The funny thing is Rashad Amos, Chuck Martin's thing for a while has been that he goes running back by committee. Last year, Rashad Amos was a bell cow just because Rashad Amos was so good. But this year, I think that he's probably going to go more back toward that running back by committee. I think you'll see a lot of Keon Mosey, a lot of Kenny Tracy. Dylan Downing seemed to be working in quite a bit. Jordan Brunson also was a transfer from, I believe, Virginia Tech, but somewhere Power 5 a couple years ago. Didn't see much action last year, but he had a really good game against Delaware State in their FCS game. He had over 100 yards and a touchdown. I really think they're going to be fine in the running back room. Honestly, even without Rashad Amos, there's still, 4 or 5 guys who you'd think would be able to be productive running backs in the Mid-American Conference.
That's great to hear. Talking about that passing game again, with Brett Gabbert back, that passing game should certainly improve upon the production from 2023. They do lose Gage Larverdane off to South Carolina and Joe Wilkins Jr. and Miles Marshall to graduation, but they return Cade McDonald, Javon Tracy, and they bring in Andre Johnson from Arizona State. What can you tell us about this wide receiver room?
Yeah, the loss of Gage Larverdane is huge. I forget after which game it was last year, but at one point, Larverdane was dealing with some injuries, and Chuck Martin said, he's our best player head and shoulders, and that includes Brett Gabbert, last year's MAC Defensive Player of the Year, Matt Salopek, all these really, really strong football players. So I think you're going to see Gage Larverdane playing on Sundays at some point. But there are some guys there who are poised to take a step up. Cade McDonald, like you mentioned, transfer from Michigan State, had a really strong year last year, limited targets. Javon Tracy in that MAC championship game had a really, really big game. He was a freshman last year. I'd expect to see him take a major step forward this year. Andre Johnson, don't really know exactly what to expect from him. Obviously, didn't see a ton of the field at Arizona State, but he looked strong in the spring game. He's a really big guy, so I think he might kind of take over that Miles Marshall role a little bit. More of, kind of a jump ball, contested catch type of guy. And Chuck Martin said at the spring game, the skill positions, especially receivers, were ugly. It hasn't been great. There's a lot of young guys taking reps, but that's pretty much what he said last year too. And then they ended up winning the MAC championship. So, don't let Chuck Martin fool you. He's might not be as down as his guys as he thinks. He might just kind of be trying to light a fire under them a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that overall there's a few guys poised to take a major step forward. I don't think that they'll be too horribly affected by the loss of Larvadain and those other couple guys.
Yeah, I mean they kind of have a great history there in terms of productive wide receivers. You go from Larvadain to Mac Hippenhammer and Jack Sorensen. Kind of in most recent years, kind of been some a lot of production and 1,000-yard seasons there. Was if you had to pick one guy to maybe kind of step up, is that in that wide receiver one role, was there one guy that stood out that you think might have a chance to do that?
It's a really interesting question because you're right. I mean, every year that Brett Gabbert's been on the field for an entire year, there has been a near 1,000-yard receiver, a 1,000-yard receiver. He finds his favorite guy quickly, and he fires the ball into him all the time. If I had to guess, the two most experienced guys on that roster, at least pass catching wise, are going to be Cade McDonald and Javon Tracy. Those are both guys that Gabbert had a nice rapport with at times last year before he got injured. So I would say one of them. I think that Cade McDonald would probably be the safe bet just because he's been around longer, played Power 5 football, got more targets last year. But I think Javon Tracy would really be kind of like the wild card there. I could definitely see him going for a big year.
Awesome. Staying with that passing game, let's move on over to the tight ends. They do lose Luke Bolden to graduation, but they return a guy that I think has a great name in Jack Coldiron, and also as well as Nate Mersch, and they bring in Preston Daniel over from Florida State. How did those guys look this spring?
Yeah, I think the fact that Jack Coldiron is coming back is huge. Last year he got hurt early in the Miami game, week 1, Miami versus Miami game. But at one point in the season, or a couple times in the season, when Gabbert was out, Larvadain was out, and then obviously Coldiron was out for the whole year, Chuck Martin would say probably our 3 best players on offense are injured right now. So at least Chuck Martin thinks that Jack Coldiron is one of his top 3 players on his roster last year. I think he is going to have a really big season. And Nate Mersch is a really strong player too. Really big, really strong. He was really expected to have a bigger role last year, but then guys like Gage Larvadain and Cade McDonald really stepped up, and Mersch kind of ended up taking a back seat. I think that the tight ends room is going to be good. They've got a couple really big, strong guys there who I think will be able to really carry the load. They look good in the spring game. A lot of them are pretty experienced. I think that the tight ends are not going to be an issue for the Redhawks in 2024.
So, kind of read between the line, it kind of sounds like maybe with the loss of Larvadain and some production at receiver, that maybe we might see some more production out of tight end, specifically Jack Coldiron. That's great news.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that Coldiron definitely is going to be a guy to look to step up. If there was stock out there for college football players, I would probably buy Jack Coldiron stock, and same with Nate Mersch too. I mean, it won't be as much as Coldiron most likely, but I think he'll get some extra targets as well.
Awesome. So the offensive line, unlike most of the rest of the offense, they kind of return almost everyone. They return 4 or 5 starters. It definitely looks like it could be a strength of this team in 2024. How did those guys look in the spring?
Yeah, the offensive line looked very strong in the spring, and Chuck Martin said it. That's probably his most experienced unit, at least his most experienced unit on offense. And they're guys you can count on. They're really big, strong guys. If you look at the Miami depth chart, you would almost think you're looking at a SEC type of depth chart, but just because of the size of these guys, 6'8", 6'7", 310, 320. So they're big, they're strong, they're experienced. I don't really know what else you could ask for from your offensive line.
That's great news to hear for protection for Gabbert and for that strong running game.
Absolutely.
If you had to pick an offensive player, one offensive player to kind of have a breakout season in 2024, who would that be?
It's a tough question. I mean, Brett Gabbert obviously has had a really strong career already. Won MAC Freshman of the Year his freshman year and led the Redhawks to a MAC championship. Was second, had a really, really good year as a junior after the COVID year, like 26 touchdowns to 4 interceptions, I want to say. But I really think that this year, Curtis Rourke's out of the MAC, DeQuan Finn's out of the MAC, Brett Gabbert going in. He's going to be the preseason first team quarterback. I really think that Brett Gabbert could have the type of year that I'm not going to say gets him on NFL radars necessarily, but the type of year that maybe gets him a little bit on NFL radars, not as like a first round guy, even though we know this upcoming quarterback class is not very strong. But I think he's going to have a type of year that makes, kind of puts the world on notice. If Brett Gabbert was 2 inches taller, he would not be at Miami. I can tell you that right now.
Awesome to hear. Awesome to hear.